Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Channel Revelations. I'm Ethan Fox, and I'm here with Micheila Sheldan. And today we'll be doing a channeled session again. And as I always say in these channeled revelation shows, I don't discuss any of the questions with Micheila ahead of time, so she has no idea what we're going to talk about. Just so, she is a trance channel, so she is not consciously aware of what we're discussing while the guides are speaking. So we have a really clear and pure connection to higher dimensional beings and their wisdom. But just to be sure that her mind and intellect doesn't interfere with the information at all, I don't discuss any of these topics with her beforehand. And generally, by the time we're done, she doesn't remember anything we talked about either. So whenever you're ready, we can start. And just bring in whatever guides we can start with, and then I'll go from there.
Well, we have the presence of many. We're working with the Council of Light.
Okay, great. So, in many discussions that we've had in the past with the Pleiadians and I believe the Council of Light as well, the topic has been discussed a lot about how how we are in a time on planet Earth right now where we're in a different way re-experiencing the Great Flood or the cataclysmic time that was similar to the Great Flood that happened. Is that true, first of all?
It is true, but of course, every timeline that is repeated is a bit different than how it has manifested before. And there are many different components or reasons as to why that would be, including the dimension that you are in and the types of beings that are present on the planet. As well, you must consider that a great amount of linear time has elapsed since these previous events have taken place. So you are essentially on a completely different planet than the one in which that timeline took place. But certainly we do agree that this is one of the more significant influences that are coming back to affect the collective currently.
Okay. Now I realize, just to preface, and especially for those who are watching from home, that I understand that the kind of discussions we're going to have in this particular conversation are going to be a little bit hard to tangibly bring to a grounded three-dimensional level, because we're going to be discussing some multidimensional ideas here. But we're going to do the best we can. So in that context, then, in a linear timeline perspective, if it's possible to articulate that, was this great flood about 9 to 12,000, 13,000 years ago, something like that?
We could confirm that, yes, what you are saying is true, but also, as you have already suggested, we must answer these questions in a more universal way, because to truly understand time and these events and how they come back around, you must understand that you're moving through dimensions and space and time. And as you do so, it's truly not possible to make a determination of number of years between these various periods. And the reason we believe this is because these events are still taking place, in other words. And then we hate to introduce such a confusing analogy right off the bat, but everything that has ever happened throughout the universe, it is assumed to have a beginning and an end. But that isn't necessarily so. Evolution is taking place throughout the cosmos, and things that have happened here are manifesting elsewhere and have resolved themselves or become different challenges. And this is true of the event that you speak of.
Okay, of course, as human beings, we are living in a third dimensional, fourth dimensional, linear timeline where we're dealing with time. And so it's hard for most of us to comprehend multidimensional concepts, although I'm sure many of the people watching the show can understand those ideas, at least intellectually. So when you say these events are still happening, what you're referring to, and correct me if I'm on the wrong track, is that all experiences that have ever happened, as you said, are still happening and are always happening, meaning even though we can say that was 12, 13,000 years in our linear past, in this linear past that I'm sitting in right now, that experience is still occurring in a non-linear way. And as a result, the outcome of that is still occurring could still change and influence what we're experiencing in our current linear future from that time, even though from a linear perspective, we would say that's in our past. Does that make any sense?
We agree with what you're saying, and perhaps to simplify, what happens on a specific planet, it isn't necessarily relegated to the experience of the beings who are there. In other words, everything that's happening, everything that you're creating, is affecting everything else throughout the universe, and this is why. Many of us who assemble as intergalactic beings come to support humanity and other races in raising consciousness and becoming very aware of how they are interacting and interplaying in various timelines. So we'll give you an example of how this works, and we want to take it up to the highest level and then bring it down to a more individual soul level and make it more personal. Throughout the cosmos, everything that has ever been created still exists. And many are familiar with the term the Akashic Records. We believe the Akashic Records are a living legacy of everything that has ever happened before in a spiral continuum coming around to affect something else. And this doesn't, again, necessarily mean that it is relegated to the planet in which it happened. And this is obvious in much of what you're experiencing today in terms of some of the genetic wars that have gone on in multiple star systems and on planets beyond Earth. These things are now entwined with human history, and you're experiencing them not because you've done something wrong, but because our purpose, all of us, throughout the universe, is to expand the experiences that we are able to have, meaning we're taking what was before and we are influencing them to always become something different in hopes of a more improved life that we are all able to live together. But if we take that analogy and we bring it down to the individual and what you're asking us about the Great Flood, for example, every individual who chooses to exist within a specific race or incarnate, for example, as human, is carrying a contract to work with specific timelines that have actually taken place on the planet before. So certainly there are commonalities between all of these themes and events, but let's say, for example, becoming human predisposes you to having to deal with the Great Flood the way it happened on Earth. And so within your DNA, collectively, there is a time in which that event will somewhat begin to bubble to the surface. And we want to be very clear that it doesn't have to be a flood at all. What's most important about any timeline, like the Great Flood, for instance, is the vibrational contribution of all the souls who have gone through it. It's building to become a creative event and how it has continued to resurface and replay again and again. So often, this timing is based on an evolutionary threshold. Humans arrive collectively at a point in history where they are now matching something about that event. And it is often a collective emotional response. It could be fear, for example. And we see these events even coming back around because there is so much attention placed on them. It is not the only factor. And we're not saying that you should never look at history and understand it, but how you perceive it has a great deal to do with how it resurfaces. And within each one of you, there are similar components that are far more personal. As you know, you've lived lifetimes before, and you categorize them as past lives or sometimes even future lives. And while the timing of them isn't exactly important because they're all taking place simultaneously, there are common threads wound within them that must resurface as events in your life. So many people would say we should go back and heal our past life karma. And, and to us, we think every component of that past life karma that you need to address exists in the here and now for you to actually encounter and have a response to. So it is interesting, we think, to go back and to calculate these periods of time and to understand when they took place, and to even research the universal laws and methods of how they resurface. But to simplify everything, in the present moment, in the quantum reality that you exist within, every timeline you've ever touched before is a possibility for you to either relive or change.
Is the Earth and the Earth's consciousness in some way isolated from the rest of the universe due to the extremity of the activities on the planet today?
It has been, but this is no longer truly the case. So let's explain. And as the Council of Light, we are the perfect ones to answer this because we are a council of representatives from every planet throughout the universe. And we have formed very long ago for the purpose of understanding the relationship between all things, or the inherent connection in how energy flows. And what we have come to realize is that, again, and we've mentioned this in our first answer, you are not just affecting your own life. Everything that you are doing here, it immediately has an impact on the collective you chose, humanity. But that vibration is sent out to other planets and other star systems. So, for example, in Pleiades, there may have been an incredible evolutionary passage in which beings learned how to work with emotional intelligence. And through that experience, they became a far more loving collective and civilization and experienced many benefits. But if there are wars going on planet Earth and emotion is not being constructively processed, that can set back other planets and star systems. And this is a very simplified explanation we want you to know because it isn't quite that easy. There are so many different determining factors, for example, higher dimensions versus lower, and the impact of the wave of vibration in those relationships has a bearing on these various things that we're talking about. But all of that aside, very long ago, a very unfortunate event took place on planet Earth. And we've had many unfortunate events, not unlike all of us who are speaking to you now. But in particular, it was we'll say, cataclysmic event at the very beginning of Earth's manifestation, where many different beings from different star systems volunteered to come and seed a new race. And this is a story that we have shared many times having to do with reptilians. Reptilians who were in a very dire situation, coming to your planet to harvest their own DNA because they were certainly here and seeded the most beneficial and benevolent parts of them within you. But all of that aside, what we began to notice was there were so many distortions happening here. Anytime a race is taken out of its creative power or its sovereignty, the timelines that are created are going to have a very profound negative effect on other races. So we, along with you, because you are a part of this council, which we could go into detail about as well, decided to encapsulate the Earth. Now, encapsulation itself could be a topic we could speak to for hours. It is not a sanction, and this is most important to understand. It's more of a, we'll say, protective layer whereby anything that does not reach a certain threshold of consciousness cannot pass. But the unfortunate part of an encapsulation is that universal energy also has a hard time getting through. So, if, for example, you're creating wars here, and that vibration of war is a very low frequency, the encapsulation would not allow that experience to be passed on, let's say, to other star systems to influence timelines or creations that are taking place elsewhere. But the same goes for what is coming in. What is coming in, if it is higher than the threshold of the beings that are inside the encapsulation, it is very difficult to assimilate. Now, all of this aside, there's been so many miraculous changes having to do with the Earth and this encapsulation. In fact, we could say it is almost completely disintegrated. So you exist on a brand new Earth right now with grid connections to the greater universe, more information coming in from the cosmos that you are able to assimilate, and less concern about what's happening here. And we know your question may be, what about all of the negative things that are taking place on our planet? Well, certainly we have concerns about those, but consciousness is the most important consideration. And even though you are seeing a lot of difficult experiences still playing out, the reason for them is a raise in consciousness, meaning right now you are purging some of the densest energy that you have been held back from for decades of time. So what we monitor is not only the activities that are taking place on a certain planet, but the inner growth, and as a collective, how that scale of consciousness and vibration is changing. And certainly what we've seen is a higher threshold of new timelines that are more fifth dimensional in nature. And that is a positive as well, because those will cancel out or override the ones that are lower in their dimension.
Okay. Understanding everything that we just discussed today, I'm still going to ask a lot of very grounded, third dimensional, linear questions because otherwise these shows would be boring, would have nothing to talk about. And my role here is to bring these concepts into an intellectual perspective that the average human being can comprehend and apply in their lives, integrated with the multidimensional concepts so that it makes more sense to us because we are operating in a third dimensional construct. And as a result, there are certain third dimensional perspectives or structures that we have, our minds, which process information in a more linear way. And so from that perspective, you say that this encapsulation is pretty much gone right now. In our linear perspective, when did this occur? Was this 5 years ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago?
It has been a gradual change, and it had to be. In fact, there were times when we saw a great deal of progress and backward motion because an encapsulation is a living consciousness, not unlike a planet. It is a plasmic type of energy and interference. So it has to evaluate everything that is going through it and everything that is created within it, which we know is difficult to understand. But imagine your human aura. While your human aura is not a separate consciousness of you, it is a conscious part of your human technology that is always sharing and expressing what the true soul essence is experiencing. And this is very similar to what's happened on Earth. But we do want to make a slight correction because you mentioned that humans are living in a third dimensional construct. We don't necessarily agree with that statement because what's happening on planet Earth right now is a new multi-dimensional energy being ushered in. So we are seeing timelines that certainly do still exist in the third dimension, which is simply a more material and slower speed of vibration than as you move upwards in number. but we're also seeing timelines existing in fourth and fifth dimensional energies. So it's hard for us to say that every human is actually living in the same dimensional reality right now. And that is both an incredible experience as well as we know quite chaotic, because it may seem as if you are living in completely separate worlds, and in many respects, you are.
Okay, so many of us, and probably the majority of people watching a show like this, are probably operating in many dimensions simultaneously, right? And while still walking in the third dimension as well. I mean, is it possible for a human being to be walking in the third dimension in a physical body and not have some third dimensional expression at all, but be fifth dimensional entirely, for example?
Not necessarily. Actually, we would say it's the other way around. We see more people who are embodied in fifth dimensional timelines going back and forward and intersecting with more third and fourth dimensional experiences, because the bandwidth of consciousness is there to handle that. Many of you understand the term cognitive dissonance. It's used quite often in spiritual circles, that we see humans who are not available to entertaining our ideas and beliefs. But cognitive dissonance isn't actually a choice. Those who are fully ingrained in the third dimension only, again, do not have the bandwidth of consciousness or energy to perceive beyond it. And that is why many of the same choices are being made over and over again. So, souls who break free of that dimension, meaning they have some type of spiritual awakening or raise of consciousness, may still be operating in the third dimension, but they will begin operating in the third dimension differently to accommodate what they now know.
To distill that down into a human practical perspective, you're essentially saying that when we go to our Christmas and Thanksgiving family dinners, trying to convince other people of a multidimensional reality and how we see reality, is there's no point in doing that, is what you're saying, because they are not able to access that knowledge. And when they can, or when they become more multidimensional in their functioning here, they'll just naturally gravitate to those ideas themselves.
We don't even look at it as knowledge, we look at it as options. Those who are more fifth dimensional, and we're not making a judgment here, we're simply just stating the reality as we know it through universal law. Those who are operating in higher dimensions, who have a higher consciousness, are multidimensional and perceiving more options. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone in the fifth dimension has the same beliefs. It doesn't necessarily mean that there is one truth, which we know is difficult for many of you today, because it seems logical that there would be one truth in terms of everything that's going on in various constructs of the earth. Yet, what more conscious souls are operating with is a frequency field, we'll say. Again, we'll use the aura as an example. If the aura is an extension of the soul's essence and its experiences and what it believes, the more conscious that soul is, the greater the aura is going to expand. And that is a reflection of the not only amount of knowledge they might have, but the amount of options that they perceive that they are able to take advantage of as a creator.
Going back to this cataclysmic event that happened about 13,000 years ago in our linear history, there are a lot of scientific theories on this, because there is a lot of evidence around the world of there having been some sort of a cataclysmic event that that submerged many of the ancient cities, many of which are still under the ocean to this day. And some of those theories are around a comet strike that hit the Earth. Some of them are on solar activity that caused intense heat and flooding on the planet. There seems to be some tangible evidence to that effect. Was this cataclysm that occurred something that humanity or some other consciousness or being that was on the planet physically at the time caused, or Was this some sort of celestial event or a cycle?
Well, we want to first describe how we see events like this taking place from our realm, not because we're here to confuse you. We know you want grounded knowledge. But remember, if you're moving into a multidimensional reality, what you must realize is this was never one event. It was many events crescendoing together into something that you now believe wiped out the planet or many civilizations, when in fact, what we see are a variety of timelines having coincided together. Now, we don't want to place blame, but we do want to remind you that as human beings, you are influencing the position of the earth and its direction of dimension just as much as you are influencing your own lives. And that's an important consideration because in many different ancient civilizations and timeline experiences, consciousness was purposely lowered, or malevolent beings were seeing the rays of consciousness as a threat to their ability to utilize the natural resources of planet Earth, for example, or to tap into your genetics. There are a variety of other reasons. So we see the Great Flood as being the result of two very different events coinciding at once. First, the Earth had positioned itself in such a way that there was a radiant energy event, a solar event that was quite prominent, meaning it was a close proximity to Earth and affected the natural tides and the way that the tides were timed, we'll say, or the rhythm of the tides. And this began to affect many civilizations that were close to the oceans. But in addition to this, we see a great nuclear event having taken place in the universe. Now, remember, anything that takes place off planet is going to have an effect on planet, but the proximity of Earth to that event, it is important. It's an important consideration. If you think of an astrological influence, for example, you can map that to your birth chart. But if the planet that is causing the influence changes in its proximity to the Earth, that is going to affect the influence greatly. And so this is what we're saying. The Earth was in a very vulnerable position whereby solar and radiant energy was affecting the tides. But in addition, a nuclear event off planet began to, we'll say, permeate the Earth's atmosphere. And this created a huge imbalance in that atmosphere, setting off again a chain of events. Consciousness is always a factor. These events do not have to play out in the way that it may perceive, because if humans are in fear, for example, or prophesize about something that is going to take place, that prophecy or that event that is feared is more likely to come true. So you can see how that adds fuel to the fire. We have a situation that is ripe, both physically and vibrationally, to create an event that is going to be a cataclysm.
Okay, let me restate what you said so I can make sure I understand. So what you're saying is this event that occurred about 13,000 years ago, 12, 13,000 years ago, was the result of the Earth being in a different position. Let me finish the whole thought, but the Earth was it in a different position in the solar system such that it was oriented to the sun in a different place than it currently is? And secondly, you said there was an off-planet nuclear event. Now, was this in our solar system, or you're talking about another civilization long distance away?
No, in the solar system that you were in. And yes, we agree with what you were saying about the position of Earth.
So Earth was in a different position, and this solar event, did it push it into the position it is now? Or rather, this nuclear and solar event?
Well, Not necessarily. Remember, consciousness affects the movement of the planets and the stars. So, if a collective such as the human collective exists on Earth and their consciousness raises, Earth has to accommodate for that raise in consciousness by slightly orienting itself to new energies. And this is a function of the poles. So think of the planet as an electromagnetic field. And in that magnetic field are many different connections. And those connections are both internal, physical, and external, etheric. So anytime that a collective is evolving or perhaps even going backwards of evolution, what the earth is attempting to do is move itself into a position where energy is accessible from other planets or from the Akashic records that will support what is happening in consciousness. And this is important to note because right now, even what we have been seeing is Earth is moving into a new galactic position. And it's a very beneficial one, we believe, because the shift of the poles is allowing the Earth to now draw from different regions or areas of the Akashic records. And these are, of course, influenced by the heavenly bodies.
So is the Earth, can we conceive, because I haven't been to outer space in this physical body, so is our solar system a something that has a fixed point, meaning is the sun in the same position relative to the Earth physically today as it was 13,000 years ago? Or are you saying simply the tilt of the Earth or a polar shift occurred and that simple change in orientation is what caused the change?
Well, it is both. We don't necessarily see a fixed point and location for any one planet or star system. Now, if you are mapping them today versus long ago, you may not notice the very subtle and slight changes we are talking about. But from a universal perspective, a very slight shift in the location of a planet is going to cause a great deal of change in how that planet is oriented to various influences and how it receives information. But the poles, these are very unique to Earth, are a manifestation of how she, Gaia, is able to use the energy within to find that most beneficial position. So it's actually both. Both of those things happen and have happened throughout history. And we can even go back to the very beginning, the birth of Earth itself, and say that the core, which was the first to form from many different elemental energies, was in extremely close proximity to the great central sun, which is not the case today at all. The great central sun was actually supplying very beneficial radiant energy to support the manifestation of material around that core.
Okay, let's expand on that concept a little bit because, well, before we get into that, actually, I want to address a different topic. Now, as human beings looking at things from a third dimensional perspective, we might assume that a nuclear event that occurred off planet that would actually affect the Earth to such a degree as to cause a cataclysm, or be one of the factors anyway, that nuclear event would have had to have been pretty substantial and very close to the physical Earth. But is that actually true? I mean, is a nuclear event, even a small one on planet Earth, let's say, that's isolated to a particular region, still affect things in a cataclysmic way in the whole universe?
Well, you are making an assumption that the nuclear energy we are speaking of is similar to the nuclear energy that you are using in this timeline today. And what we have to explain is that there have been many different iterations throughout history spanning the cosmos of nuclear war. using the same premise of how exists today, but perhaps in a more targeted way and even in a more vibrational way. So many of the advanced technologies that alternate star systems and races have utilized throughout history do not need to be so physical in their nature. War in the galactic universe, or at least the history of that war, has actually been more energetic than it has been physical. So, a nuclear event of this nature could be a huge vibrational impact on a very vulnerable material planet. So we could use an example here. Many of you today are concerned about HARP, for example, HARP technology. You're also concerned about upgrades in surveillance or even mind control techniques and technologies that are used by your government. These things are very real, but not nearly as potent in their power as what many of the advanced civilizations off planet have been able to accomplish.
Okay, so you're saying that just to clarify and make sure I understand, this nuclear off-planet event that occurred 13,000, 12,000 years ago was the result of a nuclear war that was taking place off-planet.
Not exactly, but yes, the premise was war. This was a test that was done in an area of the universe where it was assumed to not have been capable of harm. In fact, we're very saddened to say this. It was not an intentional event. Even though war was happening at the time, many of these technologies were being tested, and they were not being tested necessarily on certain beings or races of beings, but they were sent into the atmosphere to be measured and to be monitored and to understand their impacts. But remember, unfortunately, these two events happening together was the important purpose or foundation. Anytime a technology of this nature is utilized somewhere in the universe in conjunction with very intense radiant energy of the sun, many different anomalies can take place. And again, we don't want to confuse or go into too much technicality on this. But one of the considerations that comes to the top of our minds is plasma. Many of you think of plasma ships, for example, and these plasma ships travel throughout the universe. You have plasma in your own bodies and even etheric plasma that you are working with in your energy field. But plasma is a very well-known state of energy that has been utilized in so many different forms and fashions, again, throughout history. And what happened during this period of time was that the radiant energy was so high and so polarized that the amount of plasma existing within the Earth's auric field began to increase. And because of that, the interference of the nuclear created a great deal of disharmony.
And who was doing this nuclear experiment?
Well, we would consider them Anunnaki, but at the same time, we don't want to exclusively make the Anunnaki responsible for this, and want to preface what we're saying with the idea that every race has both malevolent and benevolent forces and are doing things often that are deemed wrong or a mistake. But at the time, there was a great deal of research being done, especially on Anunnaki portals that had existed throughout the universe. And these portals were making very strong connections to Earth, which we might say is the third criteria in all of this, because any time that anything happens in the universe, certainly it's going to affect the Earth. But when portals are open, there can be an exemplification of that, meaning anything that is moving through a portal from another dimension and being received within the earth is going to be first amplified to understand its frequency. And this is an unfortunate fact of why we believe some of the inner earth turbulence created disharmony on the outer rim.
And was this experiment conducted on Nibiru or some other planet in our solar system?
Not necessarily on Nibiru. Much of this work was done within and upon a fleet of ships that existed within the universe.
Now, I sort of spoke ahead of myself. Is Nibiru an actual planet in our solar system, or was that made up?
It is, yes, and we believe it does still exist, and we are always observing what is happening there. But you've asked, is it in this universe? And the interesting answer to this question is, of all the planets that we have seen shift and move positions, Nibiru seems to be the one that has been most erratic and perhaps exemplified in this process. And we think it has to do with a great deal of the technology that is available on that planet, meaning it's not just in response to the consciousness of the beings that are there. There's some manipulation taking place. So we have actually seen Nibiru move into other universes and then come back into this one, which is not at all what typically happens within the cosm of a universe with multiple planets, but there has been a great deal of change here.
Now, there are some theories that the reason why the planet Mars is so desolate today, or at least we assume it is, we're basing this on what is reported to us by our space agencies, which could not be true, but assuming that it is true, and you can verify whether it is true, there seems to be some evidence from photographic evidence from the planetary surface that there was some sort of cataclysm that occurred there too. And some of the ancient stories that were written about this suggest that a large planet entered the solar system and caused the collision of various other planetary bodies that resulted in Mars, for example, going from being a very lush and Earth-like environment to being desolate today. Is that true? And was it triggered by Nibiru?
There is life on Mars and always has been. And you, as human beings, actually have representatives there who are studying and creating things on that planet. But yes, we agree. Mars was a very lively and lush planet filled with natural resource and a great deal of energy. And we do see that Nibiru was in close contact with it at some point, causing a great deal of damage. At the same time, we know that Mars as a consciousness is multidimensional. So we've talked about today Earth and humanity moving into this multidimensional experience, which is different than you have had in a great number of years. Mars, being multidimensional, has a great deal of potential to restore itself to its origins. And the reason for this is it has so much access to its own genetics and its own DNA in and of itself, reviving like a technology everything that once was and bringing it back into a new state of being. And this is why we think there is such a spotlight placed on this planet. Every planet is completely different and has its own benefits, of course. But the technologies here, much like we've spoken of in Nibiru and even with the Annunaki, they're very strong and very ancient, and they are tied to natural resource. The collision that you speak of, though, also has to do with magnetics. So anytime a planet is moving through the cosmos or the universe at a very rapid rate of speed, it is moving towards something that is polarizing or magnetically attracting its attention. And the reason that this happened with Mars is that there are a lot of similar attributes between those two planets, believe it or not. Even though they seem so different and have the Nibiru has been so mysterious, we'll say, in your history, they are very similar in nature.
So you said that we have representatives from Earth who are now on Mars. Now, are they existing in a physical form similar to what we see on Earth, or are they in a more multidimensional or higher dimensional form?
We would say it's an enhanced structure beyond your capability of living on Earth in a physical body because it has to be. In other words, those who are living life on Mars are no longer truly human. They've been genetically adapted to be able to work with the atmosphere there and the various conditions. But there are also technological enhancements that are made. For example, these enhancements, they are done robotically, but they are also internal and interface with the organs and the breath and how digestion works, for example. All of these things have been accounted for. Yet at the same time, there are hybrids who are there, who are human. There are also beings who are native to Mars, and they are no different than any other ET race, other than that they have their own history and their own characteristics.
So these humans and other beings that are on Mars right now, have they been there all along, or did our current civilization on Earth, our world governments, send humans there?
Yes, they have been there for quite some time, and it has been a government initiative because there are a great many resources there to also understand and to work with. There are both benevolent and malevolent intents here, unfortunately, again, which we know is hard to accept from a human perspective because it seems so linear that there would either be good or bad going on in that direction. But ultimately, we've seen, for example, ships that have gone to Mars to research and to understand the way the planet works. And some of these ships contain human hybrids and humanoids. Others contain different races who are invested and have a purpose or an intention there. So it's across the board, we would say.
So if the Earth already has representatives on Mars at present, what's the motivation behind our world governments in sending Mars rovers there to send us pictures, and Elon Musk planning, in theory, to send human beings to Mars? What is the intention there?
Well, there is a vested interest in creating some excitement about this because while Mars is a very advanced and evolved planet, it has gone through cataclysms, as you have mentioned, and at this time isn't exactly the best planet sustainably for humans to live upon. But what we see going on beneath the surface, unfortunately, is an agenda to remove humans from planet Earth and to make this planet attractive, but to be honest, not support those who find themselves there, which would be a very difficult adjustment in our minds. A completely different way of living than you are used to because there, and we'll make the connection because we know it's important to give examples. Currently on planet Earth, there's a great deal of focus and influence on sustainability and ensuring that the planet is not self-destructing. And in doing so, there's a movement to put humans in very close proximity and to keep them in sustainable areas that are very compact and sustaining in terms of resource, for example, but may not be the best and healthiest environments for humans to interact in. And this would be similar to what we would see if humans decided to actually live on Mars in the future. It would be a very different type of living where those who are planning these or we'll say even architecting these living arrangements, are not concerned about freedom necessarily or the ability to live healthfully on a planet. It is more an event of putting humans together in one compact area to keep them off planet Earth.
So let me sort of rephrase. So are you referring to the ESG, environmental social governance standards that are being pushed forth throughout the world right now?
Yes, we are. Yes, we are.
Okay. And the building of various smart cities like the line in Saudi Arabia, which is a very narrow line where everybody is supposed to live, millions of people,
Yes.
and the move in the United States to take over farmland and all of these things to essentially concentrate people into very small, surveilled cities.
Yeah. Yes, we agree with what you are saying here, and this is just an extension or an arm of that.
And so what you're saying then is that ESG standards and these things are not only about depopulation of the earth, but they're actually preparing humanity to live off planet on Mars in an environment where they're concentrated into very small pockets or in lined cities, perhaps underground.
To live in an artificial way. Because if humans were to go to Mars today, they would be living in a very highly technological and artificial way in order to survive and to maintain their lives as they were able on planet Earth. And this is where we see this timeline moving in all directions. It's to create an artificial type of living environment as opposed to one that is organic and real.
And is that also why we have a very strong transhuman movement on the planet today, where we're moving more and more? And again, Elon Musk, who a lot of people think is a very positive influence on the planet today, is working on a lot of these technologies, for example, to implant chips in people's brains. And even today, most people don't realize that if they wear a smart watch or even a smartphone or an iPad, we are to some degree becoming more integrated with technology. So, other than the fact, of course, the monetary benefits of the companies producing these products, what you're saying, if I'm understanding correctly, is this is actually part of a larger agenda to integrate the human body and being and experience with technology, ultimately to move them off planet to live on Mars.
This is not the entire agenda, but it is a piece of it, in other words. So what we see about this Mars initiative is it is somewhat like the research that was being done in the universe that caused the great cataclysm of the flood. It isn't a deliberate focus on moving everyone in that direction, but it is a facet of that initiative or intention. And yes, to live artificially and technologically is to take humans out of their true divine blueprint and connection to nature. So if we were to go back to the origins of Mars in a time in which it was very lush and full of nature and energy, we might say it would have been more conducive to humans living on that planet than it even is today. So to choose it as an option at this time shows you that perhaps the intention isn't a positive one.
So, if moving to, well, what's the underlying reason? Is it just simply depopulation, or is it that they want to keep the Earth for just a few handful of, let's say, elite people to live on, and everybody else should move to this planet where they have to live in isolation?
Well, this is a very lengthy topic for us to explain because, of course, it is a multidimensional event. So we might say that those who are wrapped up in implementing these things may have personal motivations having to do with financial abundance, for example, or contracts and agreements that they have made with others for land. Certainly, there are a group of malevolent human hybrids that are attempting to claim the earth as their own because their planets and their home star systems have reached such a state of cataclysm that they are no longer able to call them home. But ultimately, what we see happening today and playing out across the board is this: whether it's depopulation or a technological type of control, what the goal is to create a weaker human structure, one that is more programmable, one that is less conscious and acting outside of its own will. So such that the population of the planet will move very easily in the same direction, the direction that those in power want it to go. So while we might say there is motivation for depopulation and taking humans off planet and sending them to Mars, ultimately the ones who remain here need to be in such a state of trance that they are agreeable to whatever those in power decide.
And were the various things in the last few years, such as 5G and the vaccine, part of creating a programmable environment within the human physiology?
Absolutely, all of these things contribute to what we are speaking of. But remember, they're coming from somewhere. So that crescendo or collision of timelines, it is relevant here because history will repeat itself. But those who are aware of how this works can take advantage of the energy of those timelines and focus them in their own interests. And this is what we see more in terms of what's happened over the last couple of years. Certainly, we can break all of these timelines and experiences apart, and we can share why they were forced on the population or why they were important, but they all have the same common thread, and that is to lower consciousness, to weaken the human body, and to put humans in a state of trance such that they are able to receive messages from beyond themselves to do things that they wouldn't naturally do. And we could say this is taking you backward in time because there has been so much progress and so much evolution. And we'll take you back to our original statements about the encapsulation. That couldn't have been removed unless humanity reached a certain threshold of consciousness. We are not the ones who decide to do that. You are the ones in control of how the earth moves through these various changes. But just like that encapsulation was disintegrated and a new grid system was put in place and connections to the universe were made, the earth can go back in time. Now, as we say this, we're cautious because we don't want to seed fear. And we want to also include that we are hopeful because we are seeing so much in the way of positive change internally within humans, which is always the first start to that external change, even though it seems to be lagging in its manifestation.
Now, at the present moment in our linear experience, there are substantial amount of riots taking place, for example, in Paris, and a lot of people feel like this is a genuine revolution. Explain to me, is this a genuine revolution of the people, or are those people being manipulated using the vaccine and 5G and other perhaps frequency technologies to actually produce that riot for the purpose of this larger agenda?
Well, it is not to say that the people who are involved in the riots are not angry. And so we want to say this first because we see a great deal of anger welling up within humans as they awaken to things that they know are a part of this agenda that we are speaking of. So the true and raw anger and desire to protest is there. Yet the organization of it at this massive of a scale and the amount of destruction that you're seeing could only be enhanced technologically. Because humans who are truly conscious and aware of what they are doing do not have it in them to destroy their own earth. Ultimately, there's always something unnatural that's causing that to happen. And whether it is the controlling of minds or the amplifying of certain emotions or the seeding of messages, all of that is relevant. At the same time, we do want to mention that the collective we've spoken of, the one with malevolent intent, that is human hybrid and attempting to reclaim the earth as its own, has a very significant army of humans working for it who are at varying levels of realization of this. Meaning, some of them are deliberately orchestrating events like this with groups of others because they are receiving some financial benefit. And others are not even aware that they are a part of that army, yet going out and manipulating the human experience regardless. So certainly these technologies have a profound influence on what is happening. So we hesitate to say that it isn't real because we know that it's actually taking the emotions of a human soul and using them as an agent to physically act beyond itself.
And is the just to, you can tell me if I'm on the wrong track, but what is the intention behind creating such a big protest or destruction in one particular area? Is it to further what we were discussing earlier, moving people into smart cities in that regional area, for example, or just simply to test out these technologies that they've developed to see how well they can control people, or some combination of all of those things?
It is a combination. There are many different avenues and we'll say goals embedded in these decisions, but very rich areas that are full of history, and especially have underground passageways that are very ancient and very rich in energy, are revered by those who understand them. So again, we're looking at areas that are being destroyed that have value to those who are destroying them. And the question might be then, why would they be self-destructing? Ultimately, because they are meant to be rebuilt in some way. And there is meant to be ownership of those natural resources. So we're seeing a clearing, a deliberate clearing of the earth in certain areas, knowing that beneath the ground, there's still a great value there to be capitalized on and to build back up again in such a way that there is complete and total ownership. Smart cities, as you have mentioned, it's a side feature, we think, of what you are speaking of. Those are meant to be implemented anyway. But what we really want to focus your attention on are the history, is the history and the natural resource available in those areas, because these are going to be the targets of many of these destructive acts, such that those who are creating them can come in and claim them as their own.
Is this similar to what happened in 1666 in London, where there was the Great London Fire? I believe it was 1666, where which ultimately seems to have been the government itself that set those fires in order to get people to surrender their property, and eventually was the ability for human beings to own property was taken away at that time, and became essentially owned by the state. Is this something similar that you're describing is taking place in Paris?
Absolutely. We agree with what you're saying here. And even it goes beyond this a bit, because it isn't necessarily that the people there lost ownership of their property, but who would want to remain in an area that has undergone so much destruction? So for a period of time, there is no attention placed on that area at all. There's simply deep sadness and a mass exodus from these various areas, and that leaves them wide open to be capitalized upon.
You mentioned that these areas, such as in Paris, have underground ancient sites. And now, is there some archaeological value there, meaning there are ancient cities with technologies down there? Or You also mentioned energy, and is that referring to ley lines, or what do you mean by energy?
So many different reasons that these areas would be considered valuable. For example, in Paris, the catacombs, these underground passageways that are assumed to be in reverence of those who have passed on. They are actually connecting various important ley lines and running parallel to them. There are areas of the catacombs that have been secluded and shut off from humanity that were actually revered as healing chambers and sound chambers, for example. But you'll also notice that this area is rich in history, containing the path of the Christ, as well as even extra dimensional and extraterrestrial visitation, where obelisks, for example, have been left behind, showing that these were important power points and free energy devices were created here. So it isn't typically one thing that's causing these areas to have a spotlight placed on them. It's typically multiple things.
You're saying they're obelisks underground or they're obelisks above ground?
There have been obelisks above ground in this area. Unfortunately, they are no longer seen in that light, and some of them have been buried underground because of all of the geographic changes that have taken place.
And these ancient catacombs and such that you mentioned, obelisks and so on, were they concentrated in these areas because of ley lines? Is that the energy you're referring to?
Yes, exactly. There were PowerPoints that were mapped beneath the earth by ancients who understood very well the connection between the core and various important locations. And because of this, there was a great deal of visitation by those considered masters. There were intergalactic architects that would bore within the earth or create temples, for example, on top of these areas to capitalize on the richness and the properties of the energy.
Okay, I want to go back to our earlier discussion about the encapsulation of the Earth. And so the Earth was encapsulated because of the extremity of the kind of things that were taking place here to sort of prevent it from causing too much harm in the universe. Am I on the right track so far?
Yes.
So why would Nibiru not have been encapsulated when they were conducting all these experiments and still are that are causing harm to the universe?
Well, this is an excellent question because ultimately, any time that something like this is done in the universe with a specific planet, it must be completely different because every planet is a completely different constitution and an elemental being and consciousness. If we were to encapsulate Nibiru, for example, it would have never worked because the vibration and dimension of that planet is completely different. And remember, the advanced technologies there, they are to scale of our 12th dimensional knowledge, meaning they are very advanced in terms of their ability to eradicate any type of encapsulation like this. So what we often do in these situations is we observe, we research, we attempt to deflect any timeline energies that we see having the potential to skew timelines in a certain direction, meaning if we see Nibiru in close proximity to a planet like Alpha Centauri, for example, we can use certain technologies and advanced protocols to attempt to support that. But mostly, we do what we do here on planet Earth. We raise vibration. So anytime we see an anomaly like this taking place, which we can't account for all of them, and this is an important note, we would do our very best to raise the consciousness of the planet affected so that they can work out the issues at hand. But we, even though we are an assembly of 12th dimensional beings, we do not know it all. We are still learning. In fact, we are discovering so much still about how the universe works and how we are able to support evolution throughout space and time. It is not a perfect art.
Yeah, help me understand this concept because, from my perspective, a 12th dimensional consciousness should be pretty well advanced in terms of consciousness. It's certainly well beyond third to fifth dimension, as most human beings would be functioning in today. So, why would a 12th dimensional consciousness on Nibiru that's developing 12th dimensional technology even want to pursue something that would cause harm in the universe?
Well, the dimension is never the consideration for something good or bad. But remember, it is a scope of options. So let's put this into context on the earth. You might believe that everyone who exists in the fifth dimension or who has awakened within their lives is going to use that consciousness and awakening for good things. But it isn't necessarily coinciding in that way because free will exists throughout the universe. And what that means is a very conscious soul can choose to create things that are not consciously aligned or heart based. It is beyond the consciousness. It has a great deal to do with the evolution of that soul. And we're not necessarily saying that the technologies on Nibiru today are negatively intended. Remember, we're going back in time and back in history when we are speaking about this nuclear event or experiment. There's been a great deal of evolution that has taken place there. But Nibiru is an interesting dichotomy of beings and entities and multi dimensions because it changes so rapidly. Remember how we spoke about the proximity of planets and their intensity of influence. Imagine moving through the universe at such a rapid pace that those influences are very erratic. So what we've seen is a lot of chaos on this planet in terms of growth and then decline, and beings who are more malevolent and those who become more benevolent. The planet itself, it is operating at a very rapid pace and high speed. And that isn't always a positive. Just because something is at a higher vibrational speed doesn't mean that it's directing energy in a positive way.
Another concept I want to discuss that we talked about earlier was you mentioned that 12, 13,000 years ago, the Earth was closer to the great central sun. Help me understand, when you use the term great central sun, are you referring to the great central sun in the center of the Milky Way galaxy or some other multidimensional concept?
Yeah, yes, we are. We are speaking of that sun. There are multiple suns throughout this universe, some of which have no longer retained their strength or their position, and others who have. And the Great Central Sun, even though it exists in the Milky Way, as you mentioned, is not always the location. This is not always the location it has been in. In fact, it is such a strong, radiant energy that, regardless of its location, can have an impact on a planet that is not within its range. The reason that we coin the Great Central Sun as being important in Earth's manifestation has a great deal to do with its influence throughout the universe, because what we see is the formation of a core coming together from multiple different resources, crystalline element, rock, for example, molten fire blending together into a living, breathing consciousness. And the Great Central Sun supported in this endeavor.
Is the Earth actually part of the Sagittarius galaxy or the Milky Way galaxy, and the two are blending together?
We think the two are blending together, and we don't really consider Earth a part of one or either exclusively. In other words, there have been times throughout your history where Earth has been in alternate positions, even though we know the scientists on your planet are explaining differently. Because those who used to map the stars, those who were using an auricular type of vision, and those who are actually philosophers in ancient civilizations understood that their movement was very important. And if they were relegated only to one area of the galaxy, would fail in their evolution, because evolution requires a constant change to take place within an entity, a planet, a being, a consciousness. So this movement is extremely important and will always be.
So when you say that we were closer to the Earth's central sun, and let me just carry this thought for a moment to make sure I'm on the right track, you're not meaning from our very third dimensional perspective that, let's say, the Earth is moving through space in the Sagittarius galaxy and it's becoming part of the Milky Way galaxy, and so at certain times it may be closer to the central sun at other times. Are you suggesting that that movement where it's closer at certain times and farther away, like right now, is more of a multidimensional thing, meaning it's appearing and disappearing from different parts of the galaxy?
We agree with what you're saying somewhat. There is inevitably movement. So there is some physical movement of planets and stars, even though we know when you are mapping them from the Earth, it does not seem that way. And remember, we're saying even the slightest movement, it makes a tremendous change. But the great central sun is more of a multidimensional radiant energy that is directing itself instinctively to planets and vibrations that are important for it to uplift and heal. And yes, certainly the great central sun has been present in certain civilizations and even visible at times and not. This has to do with the dimension that you are in. So when you move through dimensions, it is very similar to consciousness. What a human would perceive is more options. What you might see on the planet is more deliberate physical and etheric change. And a great example of this, of what we're speaking of, is understood as the Mandala effect. Those of you who have jumped timelines very quickly and gone from one reality to another might notice that the reality that you're in reassembles in a completely different way. Even though all the elements are there that you remember from before, there is a different priority or a different order to those elements. And this is because ultimately, as material and energetic beings, you are holding everything in place through the holographic perception that you have. So if the third dimension vibrates in a slower speed than the fifth, what happens is when everything transfers with you into that dimension, it's going to slightly change. And we have to apply this analogy to what we're speaking of in the greater universe. So if the Earth is all of the sudden a seventh dimensional planet, that would mean that every perception that humans have of the greater universe, of planets and stars, would adapt in some way and change to meet that dimensional reality.
Okay, let me simplify this concept in a more fundamental way to make sure I'm on the right track. So let's say there are two different dimensional potentials, but I'm not going to give them a dimensional number just for simplicity's sake. Let's just call them dimension A and dimension B. And let's say in dimension B, the Earth is very close to the central sun, and in dimension A, it's very far away from the central sun. And I, as a human being who's having my human experience, may switch from timeline A or timeline B at any particular time. And if, let's say, the whole collective consciousness of the Earth were to switch from timeline A to timeline B, we may wake up one day actually being closer to the sun, our central sun, when the previous day we were actually not. And so no physical movement took place. We just simply switched from one version of reality to another. And that's what you're saying actually happened.
Yes, and we'll add to this with our analogy of the poles, because that movement of the Earth, that shift in the poles, is always going to result from that drastic of a change from dimension A to dimension B. It doesn't mean necessarily that the entire race stays in dimension B, but if that many significant souls have made that leap, then the Earth must also adjust. So there is some physical movement that is always taking place. But yes, the dimensional shift is going to make the biggest difference. And this is why two human souls standing in the same physical reality can experience things completely differently. There are some of you that might be able to see a ship in the sky right in front of you, while someone standing next to you cannot see that image whatsoever. And this is because you are actually existing in a different dimension than the person you are with.
So help me rationalize that idea from the perspective of the collective experience. For example, right now, I may be existing in a very different reality than the vast majority of people. And because of that, I have certain understandings and even life choices that most people would not consider being available to them. But at the same time, I'm still walking on that same planet where there are these universal influences, such as there's rioting happening in Paris, or the World Economic Forum, and all these smart cities and surveillance systems are all things that are impacting my version of reality. All the while, I'm living in a different version of reality that gives me these options that other people don't have. How does that work together?
Well, the key here in what you are speaking of in this example is perspective. So going back to the example that we have offered, in a different dimensional reality, there are different perspectives. So in a material world, you can be having the same material experience and seeing the same things happening on the news, but the perspective of them will be completely different. And consciousness is the key. So remember, what we are stating here is that consciousness is a bandwidth of perspective that opens the mind to options. This is why some will interpret the purpose of these riots or how they are happening or why they are happening completely different than others. Now, some may think we're speaking of belief here, and belief is formed through our perspective. So if we have very rigid beliefs that lead us down a path of creating a life in resistance or of very stagnant creations, we probably do not have either the dimensional access or the consciousness to support those beliefs. And it is the opposite spectrum when someone is in a higher dimension. That consciousness and bandwidth of perspective is offering them completely different options of how they see the world. And it's difficult for us to say that this is going to manifest in different experiences because you're a collective. And that is the anchor, or we'll say the common tie between the physical nature of it. And in fact, what we're saying here operates differently on every planet and within every race because it must. But here on planet Earth, because you chose to be material, physical beings, and you are a part of a collective, what you see manifesting is the result of the input of millions of human souls and their conscious perspective. But ultimately, we do believe that this is going to eventually change. And it has within the level of your life. So many of you are leading completely different lives and lifestyles than others. And it's hard to be congruent in that area or to find some semblance of agreement in how those lifestyles are lived. And that's just the beginning of how you're going to see this split of timelines unfold. For example, you've brought up the possibility of smart cities. That is a vibrating thread of potential that the collective reality is facing. But it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be everyone's vibrating thread of potential. Some of you have decided that this is not a positive for the reality you want to create. And because of that, you are influencing the direction that you are going, meaning you'll see options to not live in that reality. And it will not be a collective experience, meaning everyone will have to be there. And that's how evolution takes place. So you're in a very fast paced evolutionary process right now where the split of timelines is very real, the split of dimensions is very real. The collective reality isn't exactly mirroring that to the degree that you want, we know, but in your personal lives, you're beginning to see it. And because of that, you will eventually see the collective change as well.
Okay, let me articulate this in a very simplistic way, and you can tell me if I'm understanding correctly. So let's say I'm living in Paris, and there's a riot going on, and and I hold the belief that the world is a beautiful place and everything's great and there's peace on earth. But meanwhile, if my perspective or my consciousness does not match that belief, someone may still throw a rock through my window.
Not necessarily. We actually think it's the other way around, meaning the perspective is what creates the belief, but the reality has to take shape from a more collective input of that belief. To ground what you are saying about Paris, what we see happening is there are some souls who aren't taking part in those riots. And you may ask, well, what is the difference between the ones who are and the ones who aren't if there is technological manipulation? Well, even technology cannot interface with a consciousness that vibrates beyond it. So there are some souls who are having an experience of what is going on, and they may be very disheartened by that experience and may even have lost faith that the world can shift and turn around, but they are nonetheless not impacted by the same frequency that others may be. And this is a very lengthy topic for us to discuss. And let's give you another example because we think it would be extremely beneficial. Beliefs are not linear. A belief itself is made up of so many things. You believe you are stating mantras and affirmations that there is something that you believe, and this is helping you to align with certain things. And in a basic way, it certainly is, but there are so many hidden thoughts and emotions and subconscious beliefs that form around that. And beliefs are multidimensional and multi-layered. From moment to moment, that belief is inevitably changing. And it's changing because as humans, especially as conscious humans, you're always questioning it. And you should be. There should always be a question as to what you believe and what your reality contains. And this is healthy. It's somewhat like being the observer of what is going on and being a neutral and impartial observer that is also creating the experience. So ultimately, we believe that you are becoming ambassadors of multidimensional creation, but no one has taught you exactly how to do that. And to simplify, it truly takes a sense of observation that goes beyond the physical, where we can see what's happening playing out, but we can also know that there's an energetic part of us contributing to that. And if we work both sides of it, this is always to our advantage because there's never one belief that is influencing the life that we are living. And we get to play with those beliefs and model that creation in every moment.
So, in order for us to live in this world and not be impacted by these global situations such as frequency technologies or 5G or vaccines or whatever, the our goal should be to elevate our consciousness then.
It should be, but it is more than this. And we always want to remind humans that you came to be physical. So consciousness is our upper threshold and most important aspect of what you are referring to. Because remember, consciousness offers a bandwidth of perspective and options. And the more options we have, the safer we feel, the more abundant we feel, the more in control we feel, even though trying to control is not always our recommendation. But also remember, you are a crystalline container for energy and wisdom. And yes, unfortunately, there have been a lot of physical distortions and frequencies and toxins that have been added to that container that are lowering human vibration. So a soul can be extremely conscious, but might be negating that consciousness by making contradictory choices that contaminate its physical container and make it vulnerable to the technologies we speak of. We'll give you an example. Many on planet Earth today have come to the realization that metals are not meant to be in the body. And unfortunately, these metals have shown up in your foods, in your waters, in your vaccinations, even in your dental work, for example. And all of this is contributing to disease. But more so, metals interface with frequency and technology at a very high rate. So, metals in the body will make you more vulnerable to these, we'll say, control mechanisms, even if your consciousness is high, which we know is a disconcerting statement to make and may put human beings in fear, but it is just the timeline that you are in. In other words, you're awakening to all of these physical components because it's meant to coincide with your spiritual awakening. You cannot just work one side of the energy. You must work both. If you are material beings, that material is made of light, sound, frequency, energy. And if those things are at a lower vibrational speed, easier are they influenced by those in control.
When you say metals, are you referring specifically to heavy metals, or are you also including metals such as gold and silver?
No, of course, we are only referring to the ones that are destructive in the body.
Okay. All right, I'd like to go back to 12, 13,000 years ago when this cataclysm occurred, at which point you, if I'm remembering correctly, you stated that we were actually closer to the central sun prior to that. And that cataclysm caused us to, or rather was a trigger point that caused the shift to us being further away from the great central sun. So if that occurred at that time and there was a dimensional shift that took place on the earth, and prior to that, certain civilizations existed in this different place where they were closer to the central sun, would it be accurate to say that those civilizations didn't actually exist on planet Earth because it was a totally different timeline on the Earth that we know today?
We're unsure what you're getting at here, but the word exist has to be defined because anything that has ever been created exists somewhere. And certainly these civilizations you speak of did exist, even if they were in a dimension different than the one that you stand in today. We think the question is access. Because we know that that is what many humans crave. They want access to the history, to the knowledge, to the understanding of how these events played out. And ultimately, that has to do also with a match of vibration. So you believe that history is hidden from you, or something was here, or it wasn't here, or it vanished, or it was destroyed. When actually, energy that is created is never destroyed. It exists in a form different than you are able to perceive and vibrationally match. So, as awakening happens, what you're noticing is a great deal of ancient knowledge is beginning to resurface. And disclosure, for example, is beginning to happen. And that's not because you have won the argument to release this from those who have held it back from you, is because you've become the people who are now able to interface with it in a very physical and logical way.
When I say exist, well, there's no question that there are plenty of archaeological sites that exist on the earth today in my form of what I mean exist, meaning I can go there and touch it. So with that have existed prior to this cataclysm. So they've been here before 13,000 years ago, or up to that point in the very least. So the archaeological evidence is there. When I say exist, I mean if that was an entirely different timeline of experience, the I don't even know if books as we know them today probably didn't exist then, but the knowledge, the information, the as far as we know, archaeological evidence is really limited to structures made out of stone for the most part. Is all of that in a different timeline that we don't currently have access to? That, as you said, as our consciousness expands, we will maybe discover those things in our current physical, tangible form that I can touch and see with my physical structure. That's what I mean by exist.
Well, not necessarily, and not all of it. In other words, there have been relics and information from these civilizations left behind that will certainly surface when the time is right and when that knowledge is needed to be understood. But we must also understand is that a cataclysm of this nature is going to self-destruct a great many things, and this is a very unbeknownst to many, technological age in terms of working with elements. For example, if we use Atlantis as the example, many of the technologies in Atlantis were interfacing directly with earthly elements and using the energy of those elements to create a frequency field or an environment that could either raise consciousness or protect those that were a part of the reality or in some way enhance manifestation. But imagine a cataclysm coming to a civilization like this that had such a connection to the inner earth. Things would have disintegrated to the degree that their elemental prophecy would have changed. They would have merged back together into those elements to create something new. So what we're saying here is those civilizations that you speak of, were they real? Yes. Did they exist? Yes. Will you find all of the evidence of them if you were to look? Not necessarily. For multiple reasons. Yes, they were in a different dimension. So anything that existed in a dimension other than the one that you stand in today is a very hard connection to make. But it can be made and it will be made, and we believe some of that will certainly surface. But also, not unlike the workings of the pyramids, for example, where ships would come in and use immaculate templates to infuse light into the earth. Elements were alchemized and changed and would fall deep into the waterways and support the underground caverns in raising that frequency of the pyramid itself. Many of these things have done that already, meaning they have been recycled and used in other civilizations.
Well, assuming that, as we're talking about, the timeline and dimension was different on planet Earth, prior to 12, 13,000 years ago, when Atlantis existed and was thriving. The technologies you're describing that they were using back then, would those even work today in the current timeline and dimension that we are experiencing now?
Well, that's an interesting question because while they would work, would consciousness be able to support them? You see? And so this is why many of them have not truly come back yet, because if they were malevolently focused, would do a great deal more damage. And also you have to consider that the elements of the earth have been greatly contaminated beyond what they were in that time period. And those contaminants are going to have an effect on the way that these technologies would work. Yet at the same time, we think there's a great deal of knowledge from Atlantis that is yet to come back and will come back, mainly to, in the initial phase, restore many of these natural properties that we are speaking of.
So if we were to try to recreate technologies that we uncovered from ancient times, say even a pyramidal structure, we're not going to see the same kind of effects or benefits or impact that they would have had in that other dimensional timeline.
Well, it depends on the technology. You've mentioned a pyramid, and this is one we think is very powerful to use in this timeline, actually, because the pyramid, it is a vibrational account of the Earth's magnitude to shift any reality, meaning how it is structured is a vibrationally sound container that activates a pyramid type structure that already exists within each human. So they could be very beneficial in homes, for example. Many are visiting ancient pyramids today and having incredible accounts of awakening and healings. But if you're speaking of the Atlantean technologies, for example, or some of those used by the Anunnaki, we don't necessarily think they would work exactly the same and wouldn't have a place here at this point in time for a myriad of different reasons. So what you are saying would take a more specific and direct approach in terms of where you are focused in space and time and what specific technologies you're asking us about.
Well, at the moment, there are still perhaps thousands or millions of pyramids all over the world that still exist, some under the ocean, some under the deserts, many that have not even been discovered yet. What purpose do they serve today? They're obviously still in our current timeline and dimension. We can go there and touch them. But we, as far as I know, we're not using them for any purpose. So what was the original intention, and is it still serving that same intention or something different?
Well, each pyramid is its own consciousness and technology, yet at the same time part of a collective. So let's take Egypt, for example, because we think it's important to look at each civilization and each dimension separately. Pyramid locations were chosen from those who researched the landscape of Earth using very advanced technologies on ships to understand the important crossings of meridians and ley lines where power points and portals could be accessed. Now, each pyramid has its own code, very much like a computer program. And that code is built within the consciousness of the technology and is infused in the area around it. For example, it was written in languages of light, and many of the images inscribed on the walls of these pyramids carry certain codes and languages that hold it in a state that it is able to utilize earth energies in a beneficial way. But through time, unfortunately, what has happened is the knowledge of how to use each one has elapsed, and there is no one portal keeper or those with knowledge that are or is fusing all of this together to be utilized in a beneficial way. Yet, if you were to visit a pyramid today, most likely it's still holding that connection. This is seen in the 3, 6, and 9 equation. 3, 6, and 9, which were numerologic measurements utilized to capture a certain vibration, make a never-ending connection to the universe and to the cosmos. It is somewhat like a cellular phone. Your cellular phone has a service, and you are dialing the phone to make a connection. So those who were pyramid keepers, or those who designed them, understood that the connection could never be broken, but the user could actually direct that connection according to their will or intention. Of course, the will or intention had to be a positive one. Portals and pyramids could not be used with negative intention, and that was programmed into its construction. Yet through time, of course, there's been some dismantling underground of these various ley lines and connections. And this is why you often see certain chambers beneath pyramids having been dismantled or deconstructed, because it actually takes down the program. The connection to universe always remains, but it can be used in a more malevolent focus. So we could go on and on. There's so much to learn and to discuss about pyramids, but we think we're answering your question.
When you're referring to 369, are you referring to the 369 magic square?
Yes, correct.
Okay. And I know the 369 magic square has been used by a lot of historical figures, say King Solomon, for example, or others like him, for various purposes. Now, take me into your perspective of the 369 magic square. What purpose does it serve? How does it work?
It is relational to the connections throughout the universe. In other words, if you were to map out the various sacred geometric shapes that can be seen etherically, connecting all things throughout the universe, you would see these various 3, 6, and 9 measurements in these shapes. One example of this, might be the flower of life. Fanning outward, it is connecting all things in perfect harmony. And great philosophers of the time would take these calculations and put them into their own personal technological or even metaphysical practices, so that they could use them advantageously for their civilizations or for their own personal pursuits.
And how would we use that magic square and in our own personal lives? I mean, is it just simply to put it on a wall or to meditate with it, or what do you suggest?
Well, there are varying levels of intensity that can be capitalized on when working with this number sequence. In certain civilizations, for example, it was a consideration in ancient architecture, where the space within a dwelling was actually holding a universal frequency. And in so doing, holding consciousness at a very high rate, and also sustaining health and a connection to the divine. But in today's world, we think it's a bit more difficult to implement this into space. So bringing it into your awareness, studying it, for example, or having it in a visual in your home, can be focused on deliberately in meditation, and intention can be placed into it to receive a response, we might say. It isn't necessarily a manifestation tool. We see it more as a communication device. And when we say communication, it has less to do with messaging and more to do with working in the fullness of energy to your highest capability. For example, many of you today are attempting to manifest, and you are practicing certain things to create a certain result. Yet, that result is something so physical that it doesn't account for all of the possibilities that are best suited to your divine plan. And that's what universal energy does. It works with your own energetic field and all of the programming that's been put in your own DNA. So when we make the connection between the coating of a pyramid and the pyramid being within you, we're literally speaking of the microcosm of the macrocosm here. So perhaps what we're saying is working with 3, 6, and 9 in a configuration, whether it be in meditation in your home or in your space, you're opening up potential to the greater universe, working with all of the capability of your energy and having that unbroken connection constantly supporting you, whether it's in health, wealth, relationships, or even self-knowing.
And so when you're saying 369, using it in your home environment, let's say, would the manifestations of a 369, such as you mentioned the flower of life pattern radiating outward, also embodies a 369? So if you put that artwork on your wall, you produce the same result then?
Correct. Yes. It is all in how you work with it, obviously. We believe in this timeline, because you've gotten so away from the incorporation of that throughout society, you would have to make a deliberate and conscious connection to it. While its very existence in space is going to support a universal connection, you truly are wanting your own consciousness to interface with it as much as possible, even as you walk past it. Gazing upon it for a few seconds every day is going to continue to build that connection.
And is there any limitation to the flower of life? You said radiating outward, because the flower of life pattern does radiate infinitely, really. But obviously, if we were to put it in a space, for example, it's on the wall here in this room, it's encircled and encased in a frame, you might say, circular frame. Does that make a difference?
Not necessarily. We think the image itself is as a living consciousness, and it matters not if it's encased in something that seems to limit it. It would never limit its vibration.
What about including 369 in the naming of things, for example, your personal name or something else?
This is obviously a very strong connection to the geometric configurations we are speaking of, because you are sacred geometry at your core. So if everything that you are reflecting into the world is existent in that geometric pattern, it is going to amplify all that you are here to do.
So it's not really a manifestation tool, as you said. So meaning we can't use 369 to produce the perfect relationship or financial well-being or whatever the case may be, or even if you're in the middle of a Paris riot or living in that environment, you can't use 369 to produce a more harmonious, safe environment. So what is the actual practical use of it?
The 369 pattern is an unbroken connection to the universe. So when you are interfacing with it, it is somewhat a manifestation tool, but not in the way you would think, because you are already programmed within yourself to live a life that you are always meant to experience. But what you want is the highest expression of that possible to manifest in your life, unknowing what that is yet to be. So when we put conditions in the way, for example, we want to use the 369 pattern to manifest something of our desire that has a specific time and color and shape, we are limiting its ability. What we want is to stay very clear and open and trusting in the path that we've created, such that the universe can enhance it for us. So you can manifest a relationship using this tool, but you should be wary of putting too many conditions in the way of what that relationship should be, because it could manifest in a way better than what you are expecting.
So 369 is not really a manifestation tool, meaning to attract something specific at a specific time, but it sort of brings us into alignment with the universe in a manner of speaking, and in so doing may make more things available to us at the appropriate time that we as a soul might have chosen those potentials. So let me just make up a random hypothetical scenario. So let's say that I'm experiencing financial hardship right now, and I use this 369, or maybe I put flower of life patterns on my walls, and so I'm just walking by it every day. Maybe I'm not even meditating to it, but it's in my environment nonetheless. And it doesn't necessarily produce the relationship right now, but maybe if throughout my life there were certain potential times when a relationship could have happened? Or could it be, let's say that the relationship was always supposed to happen right now, but by using that 369 magic square, the relationship may be a more harmonious one versus one that might have shown up that would have been more challenging, let's say. I mean, how does using this provide any actual physical tangible change in our lives?
Well, the 369 pattern is actually assisting a human being to stay more in a state of neutrality. And that neutrality is always going to assist the manifestation process, meaning whatever has been scheduled as an event into your soul's plan is something that can be experienced in many different ways. And even at times when there is no relationship, perhaps, or there is no money, you have the ability to experience joy and fulfillment and support in your life in other ways. So there's a compensation going on, in other words, where it's not that we don't experience what we are meant to experience, but we experience it in a higher dimensional way, such that there's cooperation and especially unity. And that's why you see this design in so many ancient civilizations, because the goal is not as an individual, for example, to be capitalizing upon a specific modality or practice with this symbol. Entire civilizations were using it such that their divine plans would interface. So if one was without abundance and another was, they were supporting and assisting each other and finding each other and equalizing what was necessary for all to live in harmony and peace. That's where we think the most important impact of these symbols can be. So it's why they were used on a much wider scale than what you see today on planet Earth, but they certainly could come back and be implemented in a very similar way.
So you're saying that if, let's say, in my human journey, in this particular human structure, I have certain experiences that I've pre-planned, and let's say one of those was a relationship, and if I'm somebody who was alone and single, and let's say that relationship was always going to happen tomorrow, and if I use this 369 pattern, it doesn't change that outcome, but it will change how I experience that outcome. Meaning that relationship could be one that causes me hardship and suffering, or it could be a relationship that I see as very positive, regardless of how it shows up. So even if I'm in the middle of Paris right now and living in a riot or hostile environment, if I'm using the 369 pattern, it doesn't change that there's hostility happening outside. But in my inner reality, in my way of being, I'm not impacted by it. I'm maintaining a state of peace and joy and positivity, non-resistance, essentially.
We agree with what you're saying, but more so want to remind you that the 369 pattern makes an unbroken connection to the universe. So even if we find ourselves in a karmic situation, we are working more with universal energy. And an example of this might be other lifetimes and the wisdom of those lifetimes that we have lived, that the wisdom of those lifetimes that we are able to gain and we are able to implement into the situation at hand. What we see today on the planet, unfortunately, is that humans are working with a great deal of what they call karma, or challenging events and circumstances, but unable to rise above them. And ultimately, this is because the access, which is their birthright, to universal wisdom, Akashic knowledge, higher consciousness, a higher mind, has been difficult to achieve, mainly because many of the pathways or avenues to that have been either cut off or hidden from you. And it is not just this 369 pattern we are speaking of. For example, your own DNA, crystalline and carbon together create a field that operates very similarly, where your connection to the greater universe becomes stabilized and you have the ability to work consciously with more information, which again means you see more options and have more choices. But you will see karmic situations differently. And we think this is one of the most advantageous aspects of using these tools. Many would say that in a pyramid, everything becomes amplified, even if it is something negative. And that's the pyramid's way of making the individual conscious of what they are experiencing. So there is a little bit of discomfort in order to choose something other than it. And that's the beauty of how the universe works. We have contrast. We move in and out of these times of joy and sadness and difficulty. But if we are able to connect them all very logically, we will inevitably ascend, and we will be able to remain on our soul's path of higher evolution at a more advanced pace.
I've been noticing lately that the flower of life pattern symbol is being used by musicians and other mainstream individuals and genres who appear to have malevolent intent at their fundamental approach to life and the kind of things that they profess. Now, are they trying to corrupt that, or is that even possible to do? Or are we seeing the manifestation of the Earth's consciousness going higher and this symbol starting to permeate even the malevolent intentions?
But we don't worry so much about the corruption of this symbol, but we do believe that there are some who are using it who are attempting to appear very benevolent and on a certain side of history who are not. But all of that aside, keep in mind that universal energy is always going to expand and exemplify the intentions of the soul working with it. So, if malevolent intent is the focus, what these souls will find is that malevolent intent will come back in some way in their own lives. And it is not a punishment per se, it is just the way the technology works. So we have no fear that it could be corrupted necessarily, but there are some who are using it in a sense of corruption to sway the public.
All right. Well, that's a lot of things we covered today. Thank you for taking the time, and we can certainly talk for hours more on this topic, but I think this is a good place to sort of end up.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you, Micheila, and thank you all for joining us today for another Channel Revelation show. We hope you found it valuable, and we'll see you next time.